The fifth video lecture clip for Chapter 3, we're going to continue. We're still at the cell surface, cell envelope. And now finally we're going to get to this innermost layer here, the cytoplasmic membrane. So that's the covering around the cytoplasm, that interior part of the cell. Also known as the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. You've probably heard all of those terms before if you've ever had a biology class. And all right, so now we're getting to the covering around the surface of the cell that is very much like the covering that we have around our human cells. You know, our cells also have a cell membrane or cytoplasmic membrane. You've no doubt studied that before in prior classes. So a bacterial cell membrane, again, is going to be very similar to a human one, and it's going to be composed of phospholipids and proteins. And the phospholipids are arranged in a bilayer, which really means you've got two sheets of these molecules. And what does a phospholipid look like? So there's an individual one there, there's an individual one over there. These are special molecules that have a hydrophilic portion, and another word for that is polar. Polar molecules attract water. They're water-loving. And it's got these two tails that are hydrophobic. Those are fatty acids. Hydrophobic fatty acid tails. All right, and so these molecules are perfectly designed to create cell membranes that are arranged as bilayers or two sheets. And the reason for that is because the hydrophilic or polar portions of the molecules, these guys, they all love each other. So they're going to love to interact with each other. And then they also like the watery fluids inside and outside of the cells. Polar hydrophilic substances love water. The hydrophobic fatty acids, or nonpolar, nonpolar is another term in biology that can be used interchangeably with hydrophobic. Those tails love to interact with each other. They hate water. They're going to repel water. They're fatty. You guys know that greasy, fatty things repel water. So they're going to want to interact with each other. And so because of that, because of the special properties that these molecules have, they arrange themselves very well as two sheets, and that's called a phospholipid bilayer. Then within that phospholipid bilayer, all these purple things you see on the diagram are membrane proteins. So chains of amino acids that have folded up into 3D structures that are very specific and give those molecules very specific functions. All right, and I think this slide, I think I just talked about most of what we see here, a little bit bigger on this slide, so you guys can just read through that. All right, key thing about the cell membrane, cytoplasmic membrane, is it is selectively permeable. That's another one of those words or phrases that you've heard in any biology class before when you've discussed cell membranes. Selectively, if something permeates something, it means it can move through it. A cell membrane is selectively permeable because it allows some things to pass through freely and others it does not. All right, and so the phospholipid bilayer over here, you see, if you've got most molecules, if they're sitting out here, they can't just freely move across to the inside. Most of the things are blocked from doing that. Now, what can move across? What can move across? And it's easier to learn what things can just freely diffuse or move across a cell membrane than it is to try to remember which ones cannot. The ones that can, hydrophobic molecules, especially small ones, a lot of lipids can freely move across the cell membrane. And the reason for that is hydrophobic molecules don't mind all those fatty acid tails. Those fatty acid tails tend to be a barrier to most other types of molecules moving across. Most molecules that exist inside a cell is a water-based environment, correct? So most of the molecules that exist in a living thing, in a cell or in its surroundings, are going to be water-loving molecules. And most of those things can't penetrate the phospholipid bilayer. They can't get across all of that fatty filling on the inside of the cell membrane. Gases like O2 and CO2, so small nonpolar molecules, and oxygen gas, CO2, those are both examples of those. They're small enough that they can just work their way through the cell membrane. CO2 can go that way. Small molecules, just a couple of atoms for O2, 3 atoms for CO2, pretty small. They can work their way through there. Interestingly, and this sounds counterintuitive, water can, to some degree, move across a cell membrane. Now, we just said that the interior of the cell membrane, where all these fatty acids are located, you know, that's hydrophobic, hates water. Water hates fatty acids. So it's not going to easily move across a cell membrane. But there are so many water molecules inside and outside a cell that some of them do randomly wind up working their way across in one direction or another. Now, if you've taken anatomy and physiology, you may remember studying the aquaporins, or water channel proteins that exist in our cell membranes. And you, if you studied those in A&P, you studied them when you were learning about the kidneys and how they work, because you've got to have all this water movement in the kidneys during urine formation. And so cells do have special proteins that function as channels to allow water to flow across when the water needs to flow across more rapidly. Those are called aquaporins, or water pores. But some water molecules do move across a cell membrane directly, even though that does sound kind of counterintuitive. All right, now obviously cells have to have ways of moving other substances across, like sugars for nutrition, amino acids. You got to have your amino acids to build your proteins and so forth. And that's where a lot of these membrane proteins come in. Like there you see that purple pore. Or think about like sodium and calcium, things like that. You studied in anatomy and physiology about how ions like that, sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions, have to move through channels or carrier type proteins from one side of the membrane to another. So the selectively permeable membrane of a cell does have many proteins in it that specifically move substances across on an as needed basis. Or if you got wastes in here inside the cell and they got to move out, there are often going to be channels and carrier proteins sitting in the membrane that shuttle those things across. And we'll talk more about that when we get into chapter 6 and we start, or 6, yes, that's correct, and start learning more about how microbes eat, where do they get their nutrition and so forth from for survival. All right, so those 5 video lectures really focused in mainly on things that are going on at the cell surface. Finally, in video lecture number 6, we're going to get to talk about some of the internal structures of bacterial cells, and you'll see that we're just going to kind of hit the highlights on some of those. Most of the things that we come back to over and over during the semester we've already discussed. However, there is one bacterial internal structure called an endospore that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on because it is so clinically significant.